Welcome to today's webinar, Preschool Effects, What the Research Does and Does Not Say, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in the listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Matthew Wire. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Preschool Effects, What the Research Does and Does Not Say. My name is Matt Wire. I'm Senior Policy Specialist covering early childhood education issues for NCSL and will be facilitating today's webinar. Before we begin, I just wanted to highlight the Media Resource Library, which includes the full Brookings report, the consensus statement, today's slides, and the newly released 2016 State of Preschool Yearbook and Executive Summary from the National Institute for Early Education Research. You can find this by clicking the play button at the top of the screen in the upper right quadrant, and that will drop down the media resources. I also want to encourage our listeners to ask questions, so please feel free at any time to type a question in the chat box, and our presenters will have time to address as many questions as possible after their presentations. We've got a great audience today from across the country, with 33 states plus DC and Puerto Rico registered and represented. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Heising-Simons Foundation for sponsoring this webinar and the Brookings report. Today we are lucky to have two of the top early childhood education researchers in the country and two of the main contributors to the recent Brookings Institution publication. Dr. Mark Lipsey is a research professor in the Department of Human Services and Organizational Development and director of the Peabody Research Institute at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Lipsey's professional interests are in the areas of public policy, program evaluation research, social intervention, field research methodology, and research synthesis. He serves as principal investigator for the Tennessee Voluntary PreK Effectiveness Study. We also have Dr. Deborah Phillips, professor of psychology and associated faculty in the Public Policy Institute at Georgetown University. Her research includes developmental and child psychology, child development and public policy, the effects of family and child care environments on child development, the developmental effects of poverty in children with disabilities. Dr. Phillips leads the evaluation of the Tulsa Community Action Project Head Start Preschool program. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Phillips to begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Matt. See if I can move the slide forward here. I am really delighted to be joining you this afternoon or morning to discuss our recent consensus report on the current state of scientific knowledge on pre-kindergarten effects. States have really been the path breakers on this issue for the past 2 decades, and today states are the sites of the most exciting, innovative efforts to ensure that pre-K programs produce the strongest and most enduring impacts possible. Our consensus report was issued on the 17th of April of this year under the auspices of the Brookings Institution with support from the Heising-Simons Foundation and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. It was the culmination of a year of very, very hard work, motivated by a couple of goals, really. The first emanated from concerns about media and policy tension paid to individual studies of pre-K impacts as they were released sort of one by one, without any effort to situate individual findings onto the broader landscape of evidence on pre-K education. It was sort of good news, bad news, good news, bad news ping-pong game that was not particularly helpful to those of you who have to make everyday decisions about pre-K programs, costs, enrollments, etc. We also sought to place evidence on pre-K impacts in their developmental context, recognizing that child development is cumulative and that any single year in a child's life needs to be placed in the context of what came before and what comes after. And you'll hear that theme repeatedly as I walk you through our consensus statements. Dr. Lipsey and I, as the original parents of this initiative, assembled an amazing team of scientists to hammer out the series of consensus statements that will that we'll be sharing with you today, and that capture the most up-to-date scientific knowledge on pre-K impacts. So here is a list of the team members representing many of your states, and again, just to recognize our all-important funders for this effort. This team undertook the arduous work of forging consensus out of a very complex evidence base in the high-stakes context of intense public scrutiny of pre-K education. We came together on behalf of this project with deep, long-standing mutual respect and with a shared commitment to the use of science for public purposes, but also with different disciplinary lenses and different experiences with studying pre-K education that have produced different results. Call it Tennessee to Tulsa, if you will. And therein lies both the challenge of reaching consensus and the power of having done so. We held 2 meetings during which we discussed an exhaustive review of the evidence on short and longer-term state and district pre-K impacts that was assembled by Dr. Lipsey. And then we all reviewed multiple drafts of the report en route to the version that we are presenting today. So why is this statement important and timely? Legislators know that one of the best ways to build a productive and prosperous society is to start early in building children's foundation for learning, health, and positive behavior. With now 43 states just announced today, and the District of Columbia having introduced and innovated with scaled-up state and district-funded pre-K programs, it's a perfect time to take stock of how well we're doing to optimize the contribution of pre-K to these societal goals. The authors of this consensus statement have engaged with local, state, and federal policymakers and practitioners to conduct and translate research about pre-K programs. So together we are striving to understand the role that pre-K can play in the larger educational enterprise that prepares our future workers, citizens, and parents, and how to identify and replicate the most important features of successful programs in order to optimize this potential. We set out to address these pressing challenges so that people like yourselves, legislators, educators, could reflect on progress to date, identify good bet effectiveness factors that distinguish programs that have produced larger, more enduring impacts from those that have not, and to take constructive action to better meet our country's goals for pre-K education. An overarching message of our statement, based in the developmental and learning sciences and reflected in one of our consensus statements written out for you here, is that pre-K is not an end in and of itself. Pre-K education does not happen in a vacuum. A child's learning over the course of the pre-K year builds on past development and sets the stage for future learning, which is profoundly affected by children's experiences in kindergarten and beyond. Learning is continuous and cumulative. Effective pre-K education depends on attending to what happens before pre-K, what happens during pre-K, and what happens after pre-K as children enter elementary school. Just as we do not ask what second grade accomplishes in isolation from what happened in first grade and what happens in third grade and fourth grade, or hold this single year accountable for middle school achievement test scores, high school graduation, and adult earnings, it is time to re-examine how we consider the pre-K year. The pressing and most useful question today is, how can we ensure that we have an effective pre-K through elementary system? Addressing this question is the shared public purpose toward which this consensus statement is directed. We titled our statement, Puzzling It Out, because identifying the conditions that best promote young children's learning has many pieces. If you focus on only one piece at a time, one study in one place, one finding about one outcome, even 1 year in a child's life, you run the risk of missing the bigger picture. In order to place our current evidence about pre-K in context, we considered the characteristics of the children walking through the pre-K door, what happens inside pre-K classrooms, and what happens next in the early elementary grades. So our report is really about how learning gets charged up and recharged sequentially and cumulatively, starting with what young children bring into their pre-K classrooms, then how pre-K can provide a strong initial charge or boost in early learning, followed by how subsequent educational environments can sustain, deepen, and add, or not, to the initial base of skills and knowledge that pre-K has provided. So I want to turn to a key finding from one of our consensus statements. And this one I'll read along with you. Convincing evidence shows that children attending a diverse array of state and school district programs are more ready for school at the end of their pre-K year than children who do not attend pre-K. Improvements in academic areas such as literacy and numeracy are most common. The smaller number of studies of social-emotional and self-regulatory development generally show more modest improvements in those areas. In short, most evaluation studies show that pre-K works. Moreover, many pre-K programs are delivering greater improvements in learning at the end of the pre-K year for children growing up under conditions of economic disadvantage and instability, and for dual language learners than for others, precisely the children most at risk for getting left behind, their more advantaged, and their English-speaking peers, a gap that is already opened up by the time children are 3 years old. In sum, pre-K is delivering on its promise to charge up learning, to prepare children for kindergarten. This is a considerable victory in which legislators and educators should take pride. But our work is far from done. Not all pre-K programs are equally effective, and there are many reasons to believe that pre-K can do more to power up early learning. Scientists, policymakers, and educators alike are highly motivated to ensure that all young children have access to pre-K settings that genuinely broaden and deepen their learning. This means they're supporting their ability to talk about math concepts like cardinality and measurement, and to problem solve, not just to count. It involves helping them acquire a rich vocabulary and capacity to tell an organized story, not just teaching them to recite the alphabet, and also building their capacity to work collaboratively and enjoy collaborative work, not just to take turns. All young children also deserve access to pre-K settings that will foster capacities to focus attention and remember and follow directions, to develop a strong motivation to learn and positive views of themselves as learners. We offer some good bets for next stage efforts to further strengthen the nation's existing pre-K programs that are outlined in this consensus statement. It focuses on ensuring that pre-K teachers are well prepared and supported through professional development and coaching to implement curricula that are proven to foster and deepen critical early skills and concepts, and to provide well-organized, positive classroom environments in which active, engaged learning can occur, including not only academic skills, but also essential skills in social interaction and self-regulation. Even with an initial strong charge, however, learning can stagnate if children's developing knowledge and skills are not recharged when they enter elementary school. Sustaining pre-K impacts requires that we pay far more attention to what happens once children arrive at the kindergarten door. This is the newest frontier of pre-K research. And I repeat, learning like physical growth is cumulative and continuous and requires ongoing nurturing. There's no point at which learning proceeds on automatic pilot. This is why we explicitly direct attention to the elementary grades in this pre-K consensus statement. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing all of us is how to keep every child moving forward on his or her learning trajectory as she enters formal schooling. This is the fundamental task of every elementary teacher. It entails understanding each child's starting place, where he or she needs to go next and how to get her there, and how best to scaffold this forward movement for each child in a classroom. If a child has learned to count to 5 and discuss more and less in pre-K, then she's ready to count to 10, and then to learn cardinality, and then to begin to problem solve and explain her answers. If she's not helped to get from 5 to 10 in kindergarten, maybe because her classmates are still learning to count to 5, she'll be put in what is effectively a learning dead zone. And this child's, and cumulatively the nation's, investment in pre-K will risk being squandered. Enabling all children to move forward from different initial repertoires of skill, knowledge, and behavior is extremely challenging. Early education is rocket science. This challenge, see here, there we go. This challenge is made all the more urgent by current policy discussions of pre-K education. In addition to school readiness, our society has harbored the hope that pre-K would deliver long-lasting effects. Here, the current state of evidence leaves us with less to report, and we conclude convincing evidence on the longer-term impacts of scaled-up pre-K programs on academic outcomes and school progress is sparse, precluding broad conclusions. The evidence that does exist often shows that pre-K-induced improvements in learning are detectable during elementary school, but studies also reveal null or negative impacts for some programs. The jury is still out. And why might this be so? Dr. Lipsey will offer his observations about this pressing and important question, drawing on his experience as a pre-K evaluator in Tennessee. In the consensus statement, we ponder how much we can draw on lessons from the existing research base on an earlier generation of programs to guide the development of today's pre-K programs that are far from monolithic. Instead, there are different pre-K delivery systems in different states with widely varying program features, teacher requirements, performance standards, target child populations, and funding levels, all of which need to be taken into account. Again, this is why we refer to this report as puzzling it out, because it is indeed a very complex puzzle. Moreover, different state programs have been studied with different designs and measures. So it's really hard in this context to pull out one piece of this complex puzzle and say, aha, that explains the mixed evidence on long-term impacts. And to return to the overarching message of our statement, children enter pre-K with divergent prior early care and education and home experiences, and they move from pre-K into a vast range of elementary schools across the nation. If we ignore this variability in what happens before, during, and after the pre-K year, we run the risk of missing information that can help us understand how to design and re-engineer pre-K in specific locales to get the best results. But importantly, contradictory findings, puzzle pieces that don't fit together very well, are precisely what propels science forward. We can draw some conclusions with confidence. We can offer good bets for next stage pre-K innovation. The jury is still out with regard to sustained impacts over time, but we can agree on what we need to know and how best to generate knowledge that will deliver useful answers. This is the shared goal and commitment of the team of scientists who produced this consensus statement. And this brings me to our final consensus point, which calls for ongoing innovation and evaluation to ensure continued improvement in creating and sustaining children's learning gains through research practice partnerships. And I'm not going to read this one. It's because I want to make sure to give others plenty of time. But we close the report with the following statement. We have a national platform on which to build next stage, increasingly effective and longer-lasting pre-K programs. The hard work of refining and improving these programs so that they can fully support the intellectual and social skills the nation will need in the future has just begun. Nonetheless, the scientific rationale, the uniformly positive evidence of impact on kindergarten readiness, and the nascent body of ongoing inquiry about long-term impacts lead us to conclude that continued implementation of scaled-up pre-K programs is in order, as long as the implementation is accompanied by rigorous evaluation of impact. And there's no one who's better situated to discuss precisely this concluding sentence than my colleague, Mark Lipsey.
Thank you, Deborah, and good day, folks. I'd like to zoom in on the research on state pre-K to brief you a little bit on the view that the consensus group took on this. And I think it's important to get some sense of the texture of this research, because there's a lot of misunderstanding out there if you look only at the media and listen to the advocacy groups, and frankly a certain amount of misrepresentation. So I want to start with some critical distinctions that we need to make when we look at the body of research with regard to pre-kindergarten programs. First, we need to distinguish small demonstration programs that are managed and implemented by the researchers from programs that are implemented at scale. The scaled-up programs are Head Start and the various state pre-K programs. Head Start, of course, is a federal program and in some ways is different than many of the state pre-K programs. Scaling up is an important concept here because we have experience in many areas where small demonstration programs show positive effects, but when those programs are scaled up, we do not get those same effects. So if we want to understand the research on state pre-K, we have to recognize that we're talking about scaled up programs and not small demonstration programs. It's also important to distinguish contemporary from historical programs. There are very promising studies, the Perry Preschool and the Abecedarian studies you're probably familiar with and are well known, that were done long ago but have the advantages of long-term follow-ups and show very positive effects through high school and beyond. Those studies were done at a different time in a different context. The programs are different, the target populations are different, the circumstances of the studies are different. They offer some promising hints as to what might be effective in preschool, but it's not a simple step to go from studies that were done historically in that era to what we can expect from contemporary programs. Also, it's worth thinking about the intended goals of preschool. And you actually see quite a number of things cited by those who are supportive of pre-K and have appropriately high expectations. There's school readiness outcomes, which basically shows up as children enter kindergarten with no automatic expectation that there would be any effects beyond that. But of course, much of the promise of pre-K is that indeed there will be longer-term effects that follow from the pre-K experience. Much of the research focuses on academic effects, achievement, retention in grade, graduation, special education placements through the end of high school. Most of the research focusing on earlier periods. The historical studies provide some promise that there will be life outcomes after high school, employment, higher education, crime reductions, reduced teen pregnancy. Not surprisingly, we do not have long-term outcomes for contemporary programs. It takes decades for those to unfold. Now, if we look at research specifically on state-funded pre-K, so we're now zeroing in on scaled-up state-funded pre-K programs, putting aside historical programs, research on Head Start, small demonstration programs, studies, and the like. And this falls into the researcher. First, you may be surprised at the consensus statement that says that the research is sparse and inconclusive. I don't think one would get that impression from listening to much of the conversation about preschool research. The sparse part applies primarily to longer-term effects. We do have fairly convincing evidence, as the consensus report says, on short-term pre-K effects, particularly strong on early literacy, language, and math outcomes, not so strong on behavioral outcomes and social emotional outcomes, though largely positive effects when those are studied. The research on longer-term effects, specifically of state pre-K programs, however, has some serious limitations at the present time. First, there are relatively few studies relative to the many diverse programs. We can't assume that every state program is the same and produces comparable results. We have far fewer studies than we have state programs, so there's not good coverage of state pre-K programs in the current research base. Many of the studies that are available are poorly controlled and open to bias. The biggest problem here is that many of the studies do not start before the pre-K year, so that you know that the children who went to pre-K that you're comparing with those who did not go to pre-K are comparable in all the ways that matter. Did the children start from the same starting point and at the same time? We need to know that before we can judge whether or not they reach the finish line faster in one group than in another group. When you remove the poorly controlled studies from the set of state pre-K studies, you have only on the order of about a dozen research studies that remain. The studies that are available have fairly short-term follow-ups. Rarely do they go past the end of elementary school, and most typical is 3rd or 4th grade. So we're really talking more about research on medium-term effects, not really long-term effects, certainly not the kind of life outcomes we might hope for from pre-K. These studies also focus heavily on the academic outcomes and not so much on the soft skills, the social emotional outcomes, the behavioral outcomes, even though there's some good reason to believe that those soft skills, those behavioral and social emotional outcomes, might be the more important bridges to long-term effects. We really need to know more in that area. And then these studies show diverse effects. It would be comforting if they all showed positive effects despite their limitations. That's not the case. The mix of studies specifically on state pre-K shows some positive effects, often positive effects, but also no effects, and in some cases negative effects. So this is the context within which the consensus group, here we go. The consensus group judged that there was sparse research that did not support conclusive summaries, conclusive positive results. Let me talk a little bit before we close about the Tennessee pre-K program. Many of you, I suspect, have heard about the Tennessee program. It's the research on the Tennessee program. It's become quite controversial. So the Tennessee program itself is actually fairly typical of many state pre-K programs. It's a well-established program. It's been around in full scale for somewhat more than 10 years. Includes 900 classrooms, serves more than 18,000 children. It's a targeted program that focuses on low-income families, a cap on the number of children per classroom, a teacher and an aide in every classroom, a full-day program, school year program, and the NIER, the National Institute of Early Education Research, has a set of 10 quality standards that they recommend. The Tennessee program meets 9 of those, and in many regards is quite similar to a number of the state pre-K programs. The study that we did of the Tennessee program is a multi-layered study. It has some distinctive characteristics. One is that it's the only randomized control study that has been done to date on a state program. This was done by offering admission in 79 oversubscribed schools using a lottery procedure. These were schools that could not seat all of the children who applied. So essentially a random assignment was made so that it was a matter of chance whether children were offered admission or not. This gave us an apples-to-apples comparison between children who participated in the pre-K program and children who did not. And having that kind of fair, comparable apples-to-apples comparison is critical to drawing strong conclusions about the effects of the program. We collected data, true baseline data, from the beginning of the pre-K year on both those who attended and did not attend. We followed these children through third grade. We have measures of achievement, grade retention, attendance, disciplinary infractions, special education placements, teacher ratings of behavior in the classroom. The full sample includes nearly 3,000 children, and for a little more than 1,000 of those children, we collected additional data from the children and families every year, particularly so we could track their progress in those early years before the state achievement tests were administered in the third grade. And we actually have a subsample that we're following up through the end of middle school now to look at even longer term effects. The main findings, as you may have heard from the Tennessee study, were not encouraging. The positive part, the most positive part, is like virtually all the other studies of state pre-K. At the end of the pre-K year, there were positive effects on literacy, language, and math measures, as well as kindergarten teachers' ratings of the classroom behavior of the children as they moved into kindergarten. By the end of kindergarten, however, the control children who had not participated in pre-K had caught up on all of these measures and were, at that point, substantially similar to the children who had attended pre-K. I want to emphasize the caught up phrase here. You may have heard about the fade-out problem in pre-K. This is not a matter of the pre-K gains fading out. This is a matter of the children who didn't attend pre-K catching up in a year so that they essentially performed at the same level as the pre-K children. And this continued through the second grade. Our most surprising finding was by the end of the third grade, the children who had participated in pre-K in some cases were showing somewhat negative effects. That is, they were not performing as well as the children who had attended pre-K. So across all our measures, most of them showed no difference in third grade between the children who had participated and those who had not participated in pre-K. Those that did show statistically significant differences were actually in the negative direction, particularly in math, on math achievement measures. This, as you can imagine, was quite a surprise and a disappointment. Let me just wrap up then with some thoughts about why this might have happened in Tennessee, and I think at the same time raises questions we want to think about for any state pre-K program if we want it to be successful. I think what we've heard the most about the Tennessee program is that, well, Tennessee just must have a poor quality program, and these results then are not typical of any other program. Frankly, this is more than a matter of pride in my home state here. There's no evidence that the Tennessee program is notably of poorer quality than most other state programs. There's certainly room for improvement in the Tennessee program, and I suspect in all state programs. But by any measure, and the most revealing one, I think, is the actual performance at the end of pre-K. I think the best indicator of quality is performance of the children who participate in the program. The estimates of the effects at the end of pre-K after the children have participated can be compared directly on the same measures with about a dozen other state programs whose end of pre-K effects have been reported. And the Tennessee program has produced at the end of pre-K effects as larger than those of most other state programs. Other indicators like the NEAR ratings and classroom observation scores are also comparable. So we don't think the explanation here is that the Tennessee program is just especially poor quality compared to other programs. Another possibility that we need to entertain here is that the program emphasis in pre-K is not really on the right outcomes. Observations in the pre-K classroom show a lot of attention to early literacy and numeracy, which is sensible for these children, but often focuses on topic content that all children are going to learn at some point fairly quickly. Accounting, alphabet, simple word recognition, and so on. Our concerns, as we have looked at our data, is the limited focus on deeper language skills, learning to learn skills, things that might sustain these children in the long run and that might be distinctive contributions of pre-K that wouldn't, for which children who didn't go to pre-K wouldn't overtake the pre-K children quite as quickly. This bears on the point Dr. Phillips was making about the nature of the pre-K curriculum and the quality of the teaching and the focus of the teaching that goes on in those classrooms. And then lastly, but particularly important, is the question of sustaining environments or sustaining instruction after pre-K. There's some evidence, we see that in Tennessee and we see that in studies our colleagues have done, of redundant content in kindergarten. Children who have been in pre-K find themselves in kindergarten often being exposed to the same topics, the same lessons, the same content, and possibly even some overlap again in first grade. It may not be too surprising under those circumstances that these children begin to disengage when their more advanced skills are not being carried forward with momentum in the later grades. It's also the case, we see this clearly in Tennessee. I think it's likely true in other state pre-K programs. These targeted programs on low-income children are dealing with a population that does not go, frankly, to the best schools and get the most effective teachers. So even though they may accelerate in pre-K, there's the educational context in which they move at the school level and the classroom level are on the quality distribution in any state are not the schools that are most likely to sustain their continued performance. So those are some of the areas that we're thinking about as implications of the Tennessee study, some of the things we think we need to know more about, and this basically solidifies, I think, the importance of the final consensus statements from our team, which is that we need to move forward with innovative ideas, partnerships between researchers and state programs, and learn together how best to configure these programs and support these young children so that we do get more out of the pre-K program, achieve more of the potential that we think is there. I think that brings us to the question part of the program here.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, Matt, you want to pick up and moderate?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a question in the chat box that touches on the Tennessee pre-K study there, Dr. Lipsey. It asks, were the students in the Tennessee pre-K study specifically low income, or was admission open to all students?
Yes, the Tennessee program by statute focuses on low-income children, defined essentially as children of families that qualify for the free or reduced price, federal free or reduced price lunch program. So it is a targeted low-income program.
Okay. And then would that have any implications for the results that were found, or do you have any thoughts about that? I don't know if you've touched on that in the report.
Well, let me ask Deborah to chime in as well, because I know she has thoughts about this. We do know, as one of the consensus statements indicate, that pre-K, at least the consistent short-term effects we see is more effective for disadvantaged children, dual language learners, and low-income children. So that for many reasons is a reasonable target population. The need is there, and there are differential positive effects, at least in the short term, for that population. That does not mean necessarily, however, that only including those children, only targeting those children in pre-K is automatically a good idea. There's certainly some reason to believe and some evidence that being in mixed classrooms that don't include only low-income children may have advantages for all the children who participate, but those more diverse interactions may have particular advantages for the low-income children. So this is another area where we need to put a finer point on our understanding of the right population targeting to get the most out of pre-K. And Deborah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, that's exactly what I would say. And the positive short-term impacts of pre-K education are found in both universal and targeted programs. And again, the long-term impacts, as Mark and I have both emphasized, the picture is just a very confusing one that also includes both targeted and universal programs. So there's no magic one way or the other.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions filtering in here. I'm just going to go in a sequential order. The first would say, are we seeing any consistent findings for children of color, specifically Black, African, and Latino children?
Deborah?
Do you want me to answer that?
Sure.
So the most consistent pattern with regard to race and ethnicity, and again, I'm going to emphasize the short-term impacts, is with regard to Latino children and dual language learners in particular. So Latino children who come from households where the children have not been exposed to ample amounts of English language input. So the benefits to those children are disproportionately positive compared to other groups of children, including Black and African American children. You don't see the same, pretty consistent pattern of very strong benefits that we see for the Latino children for Black and African American children. Now, of course, those questions, because of the demographics of our country, many of those children are also low income. So the finding that Mark mentioned, where we also see stronger impacts on relatively more economically disadvantaged children, embraces a lot of children of color.
Great. Thank you for that answer.
I would also, Matt, if I could just add, we have recently done a deeper dive into the characteristics of children in Tennessee that includes a look at the most economically disadvantaged children growing up in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And we are seeing particularly positive effects, even some longer-term positive effects, with that deeply disadvantaged population.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to paraphrase the next question. I think what it's asking is instead of the K-12 system kind of trying to align pre-K with the K-12, shouldn't it be more of the K-12 trying to align with the preschool kind of goals? Can you touch on that?
Why don't I start on that one and Mark chime in what I forget. But I think this very active discussion about alignment from the early education system to the formal kindergarten elementary system, it's a discussion that's been going on for at least a decade. And I would that only recently has the discussion really move to a point where we are getting a clear sense of what we mean by alignment. What are the critical elements of alignment? How would you even know when you've done a good job of it? And there is minimal research on the contribution of alignment to the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing for children in elementary school who attended or not attended preschool education. And so, the question really is, assuming we know what alignment is and can measure it, does it add to the value of a child simply having a high-quality preschool program and then a high-quality kindergarten and then a high-quality, first grade experience? So there's sort of a value-added question that is really critical. There is some excellent work now happening to address exactly that question, which I think will be very helpful to those of us who think there is something to this issue of alignment. And then specifically to address your question of kind of direction, I think most people now really believe that there's certainly elements that are more typical in preschool classrooms that it would be great if elementary schools adopted more of, such as parent involvement. And then there are also practices in elementary school classrooms that preschool classrooms could benefit from. So I think most people now see it as very much a two-way street.
Thanks, Deborah. Let me just add that that when we think about alignment, which is really an important topic in this context, as Deborah said, it's a complex concept, and we don't want to think too globally about that. If you think about the children starting kindergarten, some have had pre-K, some have not had pre-K, some have had other preschool experiences, some have come from middle-class families that have supported the early learning of the children. You're starting the alignment question with a great deal of diversity in the children who are coming into the classrooms. So while you need some trajectories that are appropriate for moving all the children forward in quality educational experiences, a great deal of individuated instruction is going to be necessary to deal effectively with that diversity. And that needs to be nested within any kind of aligned trajectories, I think.
Great, thank you. The next question asks, are there certain features shared by the pre-K programs with the positive impacts? And I'm assuming this is referring to, in your meta-analysis of the research that was really showing the highest effects, if there are any commonalities that were found.
Well, I can say in terms of the research specifically on state pre-K with the medium and longer term outcomes, there's not sufficient differentiation to really identify any program that stands out or any characteristics of particularly successful programs. That's not by any means to say that there aren't differences in programs and differences in quality and quite possibly differences in medium and long-term outcomes. We just don't have the evidence to make statements about that. There are indications in the short-term outcomes that the pre-K experiences and curricula themselves do make a difference. This is not an area with as much research as we would like to have, but as the consensus statement indicated, the best bets, given what we know now, are use of an evidence-based curriculum in the hands of a teacher who is trained and supported, particularly with ongoing coaching to deliver that curriculum. And Deborah, you may well want to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And much of the evidence on this question is coming from research specifically on early childhood curricula, which we did not review as part of the consensus report. There also is a body of evidence on what you might call enhanced pre-K interventions, so programs that really focus on high quality literacy instruction, or use an evidence-based math curriculum, or focus very specifically on children's social-emotional development. And then they compare children in kind of the enhanced classrooms with children who are in more typical pre-K classrooms, and the children in the enhanced program tend to do better. So that's very important research, which is guiding our sense that, we really have to pay attention in a very detailed way to what are the educational and social emotional transactions that are occurring between teachers and children and among children in these classrooms, and that's where the answer is going to reside. But we did not specifically review all of that evidence on enhanced pre-K and curriculum interventions and so on, but it is out there.
Okay, great. The next question touches on it seems to me the efforts for sustaining pre-K into K, and if there are any good examples across the country. And I don't know if this is something you dove very deeply in, but if you have any comments, that'd be great.
Well,
Mark, it'd be great for you to talk about Tennessee, yeah.
Yeah, this is a question about partnerships, and our Tennessee study began with a very close partnership with our State Department of Education and the early learning unit there. And we have continued that through the years, including adding elements that address the sustaining instruction question that the participant raises here. And one of the things that one of my colleagues here, Dale Farron, who's my collaborator on our Tennessee study, is particularly involved in is two deep dives in the Nashville programs and the Memphis programs, looking at in partnership with those school districts and the state, looking at with classroom observations at the nature of the alignment and the experiences the children have as they move through the grades. It's surprising how little we know, actually, about the experiences of children in kindergarten and first grade who have had pre-K and who have not had pre-K. So we hope to shine a little light on that, and it is very much a collaborative partnership with the state and the districts, and involves along the way feedback we can provide from the research that we believe is helping to improve the program, and feedback the researchers are getting from the practitioners and the policymakers about what the critical issues are and the available resources and the limitations. So so far it's been very productive, and I think if we could get similar kinds of partnerships going in a number of other states, and Deborah and her colleagues have certainly worked in partnership with the Tulsa and Oklahoma programs, and get the benefits of that kind of synergy, I think we could really accelerate our understanding of how to achieve more of the promise of pre-K.
Thank you. We'll just take the last question here. Whether the children are starting at pre-K or kindergarten, it seems the challenge is that they're coming in with various stages of learning. This seems to mean that there will always be a year of catch-up. Can you address that?
Yes, I'll try to address it. You're totally right that a core challenge here that is just, impressing us more and more is that pre-K teachers, kindergarten teachers, first grade, second grade, all through school are confronted with this vast array of children who arrive with different levels of language development, different levels of math proficiency, different social emotional skills and challenges. And that's why I keep saying, early education is rocket science, because it's very, very challenging for teachers to make sure in that context that they're moving every child forward, which really is the challenge of education. So yes, there are some children who need to catch up, but there are other children who are right at age level, and there are other children who are well above age or grade level. So it's not just about catch up, it's about catch up in the context of these other children who don't need to catch up, and how do you make sure that you're really meeting the needs of that whole spectrum of young children.
Great, thank you. I'm going to close the questions for now, and I just wanted to end by thanking our presenters today, but also to highlight a couple upcoming events and webinars that are on the docket for NCSL. First is our Legislative Summit that will be in Boston, August 6th through 9th. That will also feature a session and more of a deep dive into this issue on the 6th. There are also two upcoming webinars. On July 20th, we'll have Dr. Stephen Barnett from NEAR to discuss the report that they actually released today that shares a lot of parallels and work with the researchers here. And then on the 24th of August, we'll have a session featuring a few legislators from around the country discussing policy options and strategies to improve the education for dual language learners. And lastly, today's webinar will be archived within the next week and available on NCSL's website. I encourage you to share this with colleagues, refer to it for research or anything else. And with that, I'd like to end today's webinar by saying thank you again to our presenters and all of the listeners out there. Thank you and have a great afternoon.